When traveling by plane, everyone at some point, even if it's hard to admit it, we've all had the brief thought of, what if this is the plane that crashes? Nah, I don't think so. But even then, the tiny doubt remains constant in your mind. What if... So in today's video we are going to show you what the odds are of you having an accident on a plane, and more important than that, how to know which airlines are not to be trusted, so the next time you travel you'll be, or not, more relaxed. Well, before we start, let me ask you, do you know when an accident is considered an accident? It is defined as follows, and I'll summarize. If someone inside the plane suffers fatal or very serious injuries as a result of a heavy impact or an explosion, this will be considered an accident. Or for example, if the aircraft suffers structural damage that requires major repair. It is also considered an accident if the aircraft disappears or is totally inaccessible. And on the other hand, an incident is any unforeseen event that is not serious enough to fall into the category of an accident. Note that this definition applies to the statistics that we will see later. An event in which a crash landing causes the death of only a single passenger will be considered an accident by the fact that there is a dead person. So, what is the possibility of suffering a plane crash? To begin with, there are several points to analyze. The first is the few years that aviation has had to improve, since commercial aviation developed as we know it today after the Second World War, after 1945, about 75 years ago. In these 75 years, we have seen how technology has advanced exponentially, and with this advance, aviation safety has increased to incredible levels. For example, in this graph, it is represented the accidents per million flights. As you can see, in 1970, the chances of having an accident were already very low, 6 accidents per million flights. Right now, in 2021, there is less than 1 accident per million flights, and I guess if this video is played in 40 years, the probability will be much lower. Also, keep in mind that the number of flights is getting bigger and bigger with time. So it's like if I ask you, where would you prefer to fly? In a universe where there were 2 accidents for every 4 flights, or in a universe where there were 3 accidents for every 30 flights? Obviously, you would choose the second case because despite having more total accidents, statistics show that it is much safer. You will have less probability of crashing in that universe. But it is interesting to compare the odds of dying in a plane crash compared to dying in any other type of transport. This plot compares fatalities among the major ways of transportation per billion miles traveled, exactly what we did in the previous video on car crashes. As we can see, the most dangerous vehicle is by far the motorbike, with 212 deaths, followed by the car, and at the bottom we have the plane, with 0.07 deaths. As you can see, the probability of dying in a car is much higher. As I was saying, the probability nowadays is about 1 plane crash per million flights. It is much more likely that you will die by drowning on the sea or even self-poisoning by eating something rotten. As you can see, aviation is very safe, but it has a dark motivation behind. If a plane has an accident in mid-flight, it is very likely that most of its occupants will not make it out alive. For this very reason, aviation is so safe, because everything is done thinking that we cannot afford to fail, from the time of designing, manufacturing, operation and maintenance. If at a bus or a train something fails, there is a possibility of braking in a controlled manner, but clearly if something goes wrong in a plane flying at 10 km of altitude and 800 km per hour, it is very likely to end badly. Something that is widely used in aviation is redundancy. Everything is duplicated or even triplicated, not only for the aircraft systems, but also the procedures executed by the pilots. Their critical procedures will be executed by one pilot and corroborated by the other, and the same with the checks and tests made by aircraft mechanics. All important procedures have a plan B, and everything is corroborated by several pairs of eyes. Let me present you an analogy widely used in aviation when talking about safety. It is said that aviation is like a cheese full of holes, where each hole represents a failure that leads to dangerous situation. For a plane crash to occur, all the holes will have to be aligned so that a stick could pass through, from one side to the other. For example, if an operator loads the plane with less fuel than it should, it will be like the first hole. If the person who checks the fuel does not realize, it will be the next hole aligned, but most likely the pilot, when looking at the engine instruments, will realize that fuel is missing, so they will have detected the problem. However, if just the indicators are broken, it would be like another hole in the cheese. and then when several of these are chained together, there would be an accident. In that case, they would have failed the mechanics, the airline operators, and the pilots at the same time. In this analogy, each redundancy or check will add one more layer to go through. It's not the same in a car accident, where you get into the car, you have a broken engine indicator, you just don't look at it, and then 5 minutes later you will have a problem. Something difficult to accept is that aviation is so safe thanks to the accidents that have already happened. It is the sector that learns the most from the past. For example, I will show you 3 very famous accidents and we will see what went wrong in each of them. The first of these was an accident in which a United Airlines DC-10 experienced a catastrophic failure of the tail-mounted centered engine during cruise flight. The engine explosion caused the loss of the 3 hydraulic systems that gave the pilot control over the tail horizontal and vertical stabilizers. After the explosion, there were serious difficulties in controlling the plane. At the last moment, they made an attempt to land. Of the 285 passengers, 110 died. This accident is a clear example of a design error in which they thought they had the redundancy enough with 3 hydraulic systems, but the problem was that all 3 passed through the same place, a critical point, which, if failed, causes a catastrophic failure. Today, it is studied as an example so it does not happen again. The second case was in 2008. A Spanair MD-82 crashed tragically after takeoff in Madrid, Spain. The pilots lost control of the aircraft as a result of stalling immediately after takeoff, basically because they didn't set the flaps correctly. This serious error occurred as a result of the pilot's failure to check correctly all systems before takeoff, and this was compounded by the failure of a warning system, an alarm that should have specifically warned the pilots that the flaps were not lowered. As a result of the 172 passengers, 155 died. The plane hit a field inside the airport. In this accident, you can see how checks and redundancy in procedures are so important, as well as warning systems on the part of the aircraft. Think that an airline that doesn't do the checks to make sure everything is okay before takeoff, along with alarms that don't work if something fails, ends up in a situation in which no one is able to know that something isn't working. This type of negligence makes an accident very likely. Finally, this accident is known as the Los Rodeos disaster, the worst aviation accident in history. It happened in Tenerife, Spain in 1977, when 2 Boeing 747, one from KLM and one from Pan Am, collided on the ground. One of them was about to take off and it collided with the other one that was taxiing on the runway. The main causes of this accident were thick fog that completely prevented visibility, communication failures between KLM and the ATC controller, and human factors that caused the KLM captain to take off in uncertain conditions. Of the 644 occupants in both planes, only 61 survived, making it the deadliest plane crash in history. In this accident, what happened is that the control tower told the pilot to wait to take off. But due to interferences, the pilot only heard takeoff, and that's what he did. But if there had been no fog, obviously he wouldn't have accelerated because he would have seen the other plane right in the middle of the runway. Since then, in the communications, you can't use those words until the concrete moment to approve the takeoff. In that case, the controller would have said, "Stand by," and so the pilot would never have heard the crucial word until the moment he actually has approval for it. Any accident is regrettable, but from an engineering point of view, accidents are always taken as learning experiences, so that they never happen again for the same reason. And as we told you before, that's basically the key of safety in aviation. The interesting thing here is that there are 2 parallel investigations, one that has the objective of looking for responsibilities and one completely different that looks for the aviation reason, so it doesn't happen again. There is something interesting because there is a statistic that groups the accidents by the time of the flight in which they happened. A percentage of around 10% of the accidents occur during takeoff and the first phase of the flight. Approximately the 40% of the accidents occur during cruise and the other 50% during approach and landing. At cruising speed, a plane flies at 800 km per hour and 10 km altitude, so the accidents that happens there are always catastrophic. However, at takeoff and landing, which we have seen that more than half of the accidents happen in this time, the plane is not going very fast and flies low, so it can attempt a hard landing and avoid the death of most of the passengers. In fact, I am going to show you this below, but first let me comment on another important point. A plane flies hours and hours at cruising speed, while the landing and takeoff happen in minutes, so by accumulating so many hours of flying at cruising speed, it is more likely that something will fail, but even taking that into account, without doubt the cruising phase is the safest part of the flight. And it makes sense, since the plane is far from the ground or other obstacles and is flying at a constant and stable speed. On takeoff or landing, the plane is close to the ground and at low speed. And as we saw in the firefighters video, flying at low speed and low altitude is the most dangerous. Now below I show you the list of all recorded plane crashes. Looking for example at the year 2019, of the 15 accidents, 4 occurred because the plane ran off the runway on landing, 1 of them was due to the hijacking attempt, 5 were on takeoff, where 3 of them were due to engine failure, and in particular 1 of them, the engine broke due to the impact with flock of birds. This one here is the Boeing 737 MAX from Ethiopian Airlines. The Havilland broke in mid-air, the Ukrainian one ran out of fuel, and the others were on approach when taking closer to the airport. As you can see, in all of them have happened weird things. For example, the Boeing 737 MAX used a system that clearly malfunctioned and still managed to be certified as safe. In this case, due to the MAX, the certification processes have changed, as it was certainly a scandal by the authorities and Boeing, and this will create processes to prevent it from happening again. Then in Bangladesh, there were a hijacking attempt, something very exceptional these days, and in any of the other accidents, several exceptional events happen. Anyway, something I want to comment is that safety depends a lot on what country you are flying. It is not the same to fly in a national airline in Spain than in one in Venezuela, for example. In the following list are compiled the countries that have had more deaths as a result of plane crashes. If you look at the United States, it's the one with highest number of deaths, because of course here you have to take into account the number of flights and planes that are flying per country. If we adjust each country with the amount of flights that each country offers, the list is ordered more as we would expect. And as we can see, there is a big difference between Europe and North America compared to other areas of the world. On multiple occasions, I'm asked by friends or family about the safety of flying in Ryanair or low-cost airlines, and what I tell them is to take this as a rule of thumb. If the airline has flights to Europe or North America, it will be an airline that will certainly meet very acceptable safety requirements. Otherwise, the aviation authorities, both EASA for Europe or the FAA for North America, could not have allowed the airline to fly over its territory. So back to the question of Ryanair, I certainly would not worry at all. Now, another very different thing is low-cost airlines flying between African or Asian countries. I personally would pay more attention, because the safety standards are not the European or American. And it is not only an opinion, it is a fact. If we go to the data, it's confirmed as we have seen before, or for example with this document from IATA, which represents the amount of jet aircraft crashed between 2016 and 2020. So as you can see, the global average is 0.2 aircraft per million flights. However, in Africa is 0.28 and Asia 0.34, both well above the global average, while European and North America are well below. But it is much more worrying with propeller planes. In Africa, the ratio is incredibly high, being almost 5 times higher than the global average. So as I say, take the rule of thumb that I have told you when you travel to this destination. For example, Ethiopian Airlines, despite being African, covers flights to Europe daily, so the standards will undoubtedly be the same as the Europeans. If you think about it, in the year 2020, the vast majority of aircraft have been stopped for a long period of time, even months, and this is something that had never happened before. Although it is true that when a plane undergoes major repairs, maybe it stays months on the ground stop. The difference this time is that all aircraft have been stopped at once, and hopefully this new situation is not the cause of any future accident, but if so, it will have been learned for the next time they have to stop all the planes at once. Take in mind that before the accident of Los Rodeos, the aeronautical sector thought that the communication processes were already good, or before the accident of the DC-10, they thought that they already had the necessary redundancy with 3 hydraulic systems, but then it was seen that not. Hopefully the same thing will not happen with this maintenance of aircraft on the ground. So now, after watching this video, you can fly knowing how unlikely it is that something happens on your plane. Aviation is safe.